All right, hey, one of our favorites here, Jesse Simonton, national college football columnist. He's covered Tennessee, he's covered Florida, he's covered Georgia. He's covered about half the damn SEC, as well as national college football. Jesse, thank you for making the time here on this holiday weekend, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. It's a good time to chop it up and talk some ball, especially with all the craziness happening in the SEC.
Right. So let's just start right there. I mean, we were joking off air. I mean, a week ago it was, can the SEC get 5? Could if with some upsets, I mean, could 6 be in the cards? Now we're sitting here, we're scratching our heads saying, man, does the SEC really have 3 playoff teams? I mean, is the SEC down, or is this just kind of where college football is right now with the transfer portal and NIL and expanded playoff and conferences colliding and all this? I mean, it seems like it's a mess now.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it centers around conference realignment. I think that, frankly, the SEC was already the best conference in college football. And then you bring in Oklahoma and Texas. And it's not just that, Mike. It's you do that and get rid of divisions. So you have more of these monster marquee matchups. And what happens is you see the chaos and carnage that we saw last week. Oklahoma was a terrible football team for much of this year, but they've got Billy Bowman. They've got some really good defensive players. Brent Venables knows how to coach defense. So what did they do? They dialed up a game plan that said, hey, Jalen Milroe, we're going to take away your legs, beat us, with the intermediate throws with your arm. Couldn't do it. Now, I don't think anyone expected Oklahoma to hold Alabama to 3 points, but it just shows you the possibility of, when you have these kind of, collisions in the SEC, eventually, it's a war of attrition, and these games are going to add up. Milroe's a little banged up. His legs aren't the same like they were coming off the bye week against LSU. So he suddenly looks completely mortal. Alabama loses, and they're out of the playoff. Ole Miss, reads their press clippings for 2 weeks after the biggest program win maybe in school history, at least since Kennedy was president. And you come off that bye week and just lay a complete egg against Florida. I mean, Florida is playing much better, but Ole Miss lost that game much more, I think, than Florida won it. So then they lose. And then I think the most inexplicable result, because of how bad Auburn has looked throughout this season. They score a touchdown against Vanderbilt to jump out 21-0 against Texas A&M. I joked in a tweet, Elko accidentally slipped up and said our focus is all on Texas when he meant to say Auburn. Kiffin's out here talking about, I'm texting with all these coaches and no one wants to make the SEC championship game because they're afraid of getting left out. Well, then Ole Miss, solves that problem themselves. And Deion Sanders is out here talking about, being a package deal with his son, Shedeur, all week. Well, lo and behold, all 3 of those teams lost big games that they needed to win. And all 3 of those teams now are likely not going to make the playoff. A&M still has the one outside shot, but they probably need to shoot, they probably need to shoot the moon, I think, in terms of beating Texas, beating Georgia to actually get into the dance.
Mm-hmm. And then one team you didn't mention, South Carolina, winners of 5 straight. And aside from Missouri, they've been 4 blowouts in a close game. And they got at Clemson this weekend, who's ranked, I believe, ahead of them, at least by the playoff polls. So, again, if you beat them, you would obviously jump them. I mean, is there a scenario? I know this is so tough, Jesse, because they've lost. It was at Bama, and then they got destroyed by Ole Miss. Those are the teams you're competing with. So I kind of get it both ways, but I tend to lean towards the team that is hot. And if they win 6 consecutive and 5 of them by a wide margin, and there's an open spot, I mean, I would rather give it to that team than a floundering Alabama or a floundering Ole Miss. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Ole Miss and Alabama are out. You can't completely write it off. They still have what I think somewhere, the different models have it somewhere around 10% or so. In my eyes, though, I think, and the way the committee, frankly, I think has evaluated these teams through their early rankings, they're penalizing teams for losses, I think, more than good wins. And we've seen that by the way that they initially ranked Indiana and BYU, and kind of even I think the way they had the separation between Miami and SMU still makes no sense. But I think it's less about having good wins and just who the losses if you have one or none. And so I think Alabama and Ole Miss are going to be penalized for that. The South Carolina deal, they are probably the hottest team or among the hottest teams in the country. But I do think it's probably fair that they are going to be held, to account for just getting completely waxed at home by Ole Miss. I mean, that was a game that was completely uncompetitive. South Carolina, I will say their argument is going to be, hey, maybe we really only have 2 losses instead of that crooked 3 next to our name because A, our quarterback was hurt against LSU, and B, we probably got hosed by the officials in that game. Again, that's a completely slanted Gamecock argument, but if you're trying to at least create a narrative for South Carolina, that's probably their path. If there's more chaos, Mike, like we just had a week ago, there's a real possibility that the winner of that game, South Carolina or Clemson, could get in. I do think it's going to take maybe a Miami losing, up in the freezing cold against Syracuse. Now it's in a dome, so the cold's not going to really matter. But just making that holiday trip, from South Beach to the snowy, upstate New York. It may take a couple of those type of results. Michigan maybe having to stun Ohio State, something that at least creates a little bit of a runway there for South Carolina to at least make a tangible argument that, hey, even though we have 3 losses, we deserve to get in.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of Ole Miss with all this? Because it was playoff or bust. It was the last dance. That was a big mistake, and you can look at this a million different ways. They're right now they're bickering why UCLA's Bentley's not getting carries. I don't care what a cancer Judkins may have been, and that it's funny, he wasn't a cancer till he left, and then all it came out, So, but they certainly missed him, and I would say in all their close games they could have used an elite running back. It could have been the difference, but coulda, shoulda, woulda. Yeah, it's a bust because they're likely going to miss the playoff. But I think that was the only path Ole Miss had to get there. They're never going to beat out Georgia and Alabama and LSU and on and on and on in high school recruiting, yet they didn't finish the deal. And they were just a couple plays away from getting there. Not that their fans care about that, but what is your thoughts? Because I like to make takes here. I think it is safe to say, and I could be wrong, but I think it's safe to say that Lane Kiffin will never recover from this as long as he's at Ole Miss. That doesn't mean he won't make the playoff, but I think this was a team that was capable, perhaps, of winning the national championship, and they're probably not even going to make the playoff. So I just don't know how you recover from that in terms of you're not going to have all these seniors coming back. You're not going to have your fan base give you whatever they gave you, $13, $14, $15 million, depending on who you believe. I mean, I just don't see it all coming together like that ever again for Ole Miss.
It's a pretty interesting story, Mike, because you could make the argument that they got the ROI on that $10 million transfer portal roster because Walter Nolan's been awesome. Princely has been great. The linebacker from Arkansas has been really good. Some of the defensive backs they got. Now, the offensive line has been an issue. I think a couple of those guys they got from Washington and that Joe Moore Award line were a bit overrated. But they didn't pay to keep Quinshawn. They spent the money on the defensive line and elsewhere, and that cost them. I agree with you. I would say in their 2 biggest losses, Kentucky and then Saturday against Florida, it's their accomplished quarterback that really let them down. The fact that Jackson Dart just laid eggs in both those games really cost them. I made a bold prediction in a preseason column, that I thought this would be Lane's last year at Ole Miss. I thought this kind of last dance type deal you alluded to, the fact that they had really pushed all their chips into the table. You're right. They may assemble a similar roster 2 or 3 years down the road, but it won't be this good. It's not going to have this many guys that are drafted. The fact that they don't, not only did they bring in all these guys, but they brought back J.J. Pegues. They brought back Jared Ivey. They brought back Trey Harris. Guys that we're talking day 2, at least NFL draft picks, guys that are going to hear their names called in the 2nd or 3rd round. And so when you have this accumulation of talent, and the consensus around the country is still, they're absolutely one of the 5, 6, 7 best teams in the country that could win a national title. To not even play for it, to not even have a chance, to not even make the SEC championship game when it was sitting right there in front of you, there's no way to spin it. It's amazing that somehow your hit rate on all these guys was remarkably high, and yet in the culmination of it all, it still is going to be a more disappointing or less than season than a year ago, when you were 11 ever for the first time in school history. It's kind of weird to think about that, for both things to be true. And yet here we are, and that's kind of where it sits.
Mm. What do you make of Billy Napier down there at Florida completely changing the narrative? I mean, I completely wrote him off after the A&M. And I was even among the few that thought they would be much improved this year. But then the Miami game happened. And then, like I said, A&M, and I was just done with them, as were a lot of those fans. And then for him to go full circle, and now they're heating up in recruiting, and it's just how ironic that he beat the coach that his fans were calling for. What do you make all this? Is this a case? Is this a one-off? Is this a case for more patience? Not that anyone's going to be more patient, but patience certainly seemed to be paying off here for Florida fans.
So this is kind of, I think, a fascinating kind of look at where this sport is right now from a bunch of different landscapes. So after that A&M loss, I wrote a big column that got a lot of traction, kind of pointing out the fact that Billy Napier's got a lot of issues, and even throughout this season, some of the special teams gaps, some of the play calling, some of that stuff still persisted that had been, way too problematic throughout the first 2 seasons in his tenure at Florida. Less so this year, but some of those same issues against Tennessee, wasting timeouts. I mean, that was a game they absolutely still should have won. But after that A&M loss, I wrote a big column that was like, essentially, Florida's got a Billy Napier problem, but they got way bigger problems than that. And it's kind of stuff behind the scenes, administratively, kind of the lack of organization, the lack of foresight, everyone not kind of towing the same line, lots of issues. A lot of that stuff still persists, and yet Napier has kind of been able to overcome that. And some of that, frankly, and I think he absolutely deserves credit for keeping this team invested and involved, after that 0-2 start, after so many folks had him fired. But he was also fortunate, and he would probably, if you gave him truth serum, admit as much, that frankly, in today's college football landscape, no one seems to be the first. We saw it with North Carolina. They finally pulled the trigger to become the first P5 opening or P4 opening. But with the House settlement and the $20 million that you may have to invest in your roster a year from now, this truncated calendar that we're about to see, where it's National Signing Day next week, and then the playoffs start, and then the transfer portal opens, you just saw a lot of hesitancy, and we continue to see that from teams being said, hey, we don't want to be the first one to go through this. We don't want to see what's going to happen if your roster totally turns over because you fired your coach, but you don't have one lined up, or you do have one lined up, but he's going to be coaching in the playoff. So Napier had that advantage that Florida was just like, we don't really want to go through that. Then he had the secondary advantage that Florida has an interim president right now. That guy didn't want to fire Billy Napier because he was the guy that hired Billy Napier and Scott Strickland. And so it was like, We don't want that to happen either. So about a month ago, I jokingly wrote, Princess Bride, Miracle Max, Billy Crystal. There's a difference between mostly dead and all the way dead. And Billy Napier was mostly dead, which means you're still slightly alive. And then lo and behold, sure enough, what happens? He beats LSU. He beats Ole Miss. They look competitive against Georgia. I know the score against Texas was completely lopsided. I'm pretty sure in talking to folks, that was a game they just punted. That was one. And you kind of saw it, I think, with their play against LSU a week later, that they had that emotional letdown against Georgia where you're playing pretty well, but then your quarterback gets hurt, and then you kind of get run over in the fourth quarter. So you just say, hey, we'll take it on the chin in Austin, but we're going to have a game plan for the Tigers. And they did. And I think the most impressive thing is that Lagway he's made some wow plays, but they've won it because Armstrong and Ron Roberts' defense has played a lot better. They get 7 sacks or whatever against Ole Miss. Now they have a chance to go 7-5. You talked about the recruiting momentum. They flipped a bunch of guys from Florida State in the last 36 hours. We could see some more movement on that very front here, I think, soon too. So is this a one-off? I do think that Napier still needs to win big next year. The win-loss ledger still matters, and it still doesn't look great. But they are improved. This team never quit. And in today's, again, transfer portal and NIL times when guys are getting paid, that's not nothing. That means something, because we've seen other teams within this conference and I think across the rest of college football completely lay down this season. Oklahoma State probably being, the biggest offender of them all. And Florida didn't do that. And look at where they're at. Now they're riding high. And, you could say right now, who are 3 teams that no one wants to play on the last weekend of the season? It's Florida, South Carolina, and Kansas. And if you told somebody that a month ago, they'd call you crazy.
Well, one team that I don't think anyone fears at the moment is of course, Alabama, coming off that Oklahoma game. What do you make of the Iron Bowl with Auburn will be fighting for their bowl lives? They were dead in the water too here recently. They've got a little momentum. Peyton Thorne's, he has rebounded after that fan base ready to run his ass off too. But man, what is going to happen to old DeBoer if he loses this one? And I think I saw it on Jock's Radio today or yesterday. They said if Alabama loses this game, it's conceivable they finish 10th in the SEC standings. And I also saw John Talty write this week, which I think he's right on point. This is probably going to be the most talented team Kalen DeBoer ever has at Alabama, because I don't care what the recruiting ranking is right now. I don't think he's going to be able to keep it up like Saban did. So, having said all that, I mean, how bad does he need this one?
He needs. He needs it badly. This is one that it won't quiet the critics, because they deserve to still kind of be chirping, and there's lots to chirp about. But he's going to have many sleepless nights if Alabama does not win this game, because this is a bad Auburn team. This is a poorly coached Auburn team. And they do have some talent. Cam Coleman's really good. They got some defensive linemen who I think are promising. Obviously, Jacquez Hunter is probably one of the better running backs in the SEC. But this is an Auburn team that has been uncompetitive in many a game this season. And for Alabama, as talented as they are, to lose 4 games in the regular season, I don't know if this will be this most talented team, but it probably will be, because, he's recruiting well right now, but this is a good in-state year for Alabama talent again. They've done well, I think, capitalizing on some prior relationships with some guys that were already tied in with Saban and that staff. I got to tell you, this surprised me. You were someone that I think was pretty down on the DeBoer hire, right? You weren't crazy about it. I thought it was a slam dunk, just because of, he just didn't lose. Previously he just didn't lose. This was a guy who, you could count on 2 hands how many times he had lost a football game Well, now those losses are starting to rack up a little bit, and it gets a little bit different, when you're not, you can get away with your C game when you're coaching at Washington or Fresno State against the middlings in the Mountain West, or against a bad UCLA, or a crappy Arizona team, historically. In the SEC, when the gauntlets, when you're going through that gauntlet, you've got to show up week in and week out. And Alabama, they've had the highs, and I think their high is still, playoff caliber. But clearly, we've seen the lows, and the lows are they even for all their quote unquote talent, they probably have squandered the fact that other than Ryan Williams, who are their playmakers, These offensive tackles that get ballyhooed about, well, they gave up all sorts of pressure and sacks. Jalen Milroe, a first-round quarterback, I don't see it. I think he should be a guy that comes back. But does Kalen DeBoer want him to come back? I mean, Alabama's facing a existential crisis if they lose on Saturday. But they're going to enter the offseason, I think, with a ton of unanswered questions about just what exactly does the future of this program look like, and where are we in the hierarchy of the SEC? Because you think about it too, Mike, they got to go to Georgia next year. They got some of these games. They'll go to Auburn next year. And I do believe Hugh is going to do kind of an Ole Miss 2.0 this offseason, and Auburn's going to go all in on the portal. So, suddenly the schedule, I think, might be even more difficult a year from now.
Yeah, and if it's not DeBoer, final question for you, Jesse. I think the guy that must win this weekend over any SEC coach is old Josh Heupel. Man, all you got to do is beat Vanderbilt, and it's almost a lock. You're going to make the college football playoff. And I think Heupel's done a great job of shedding kind of like the old UT labels, but obviously Butch Jones, I believe he was covering the team when that debacle happened in 2016. There was Jeremy Pruitt, decade of the Vols. I think they went 2-8. He got fired right after that. And then, of course, the end of Fulmer. It was just a lot of wasted talent. But the point being, this is always where Tennessee comes up short. And anybody in the playoff race today, they would trade for Tennessee's spot, beat Vanderbilt, and you're in. I don't care that it's at Vanderbilt. There's going to be more Tennessee fans there than Vanderbilt fans. Again, they're not going to fire him if he loses, but that almost seems like I think he will truly lose a lot of fans that he may never get back if they don't win this Saturday.
Yeah, I was covering the team as you said as a beat writer when Tennessee went to Vanderbilt with a chance to go to the Sugar Bowl. Now these stakes are much higher, but Butch never recovered from that loss. And that was the same. That was in the same season where it was like the Shy Tuttle fell on his helmet. The team was already kind of unraveling. Jalen Hurd was going through a thing at the end of the year, and that team was a mess. Tennessee is not dealing with those behind-the-scenes distractions, but this is a better Vanderbilt team, and that's what I think is the scary thing for the Vols. Tennessee should win this game. Tennessee is the better team. Vanderbilt, I think has kind of run out of steam a little bit. I just think that, Pisson Pavia, he's awesome, but I think he's taken one too many hits, and he just doesn't look healthy. He doesn't look like he's moving the same as he was when they were playing Alabama, when they were giving a scare to Texas. So, this may be a game that you ride Dylan Sampson. They've done that all year. James Pierce, the defensive line. Nico has not had the season I think a lot of people thought. I was someone who wrote kind of incessantly since the preseason, since the offseason, summer, frankly, that I thought that Tennessee was going to ride or die with this defense. I kind of thought that they were going to be a defensive first team. It's not that I didn't believe in Nico. I just know how hard it is to play in this league. And for a first-year starter at quarterback, he was never going to be this, Heisman caliber guy from day one. Maybe that'll happen next year. We'll see. Tennessee's weapons have also underwhelmed, disappointed. They haven't gotten what they think they thought of out of Braswell. Squirrel White's been okay. They've, too many drops. Thornton's hit or miss. Brew hit or miss. The 5-star Mike Matthews just can't get on the field. So Sampson has been kind of their engine, and they're going to have to ride that Ferrari home. And so it doesn't matter how ugly it is, what the score looks like. As long as you got one more point than Vanderbilt, you're going to get into the dance, and that's what ball fans are kind of pining for. But I don't know if it's unrecoverable, a la you're talking about Lane Kiffin, unrecoverable. But it'll be hard for Heupel to come back from this, if they lose this game. There'll be a lot of folks saying, you did your best with a lot of Jeremy's players, 2 years ago. And you had the chances this year. And it just, the loss against Arkansas, if you lose this game, a lot of what ifs. But I don't think that's going to happen. I do think Tennessee's going to take care of business. I actually think the other UT, Mike, and that head coach needs to win on Saturday, because you lose to Texas A&M. Is Texas a playoff team if they lose on Saturday?
I've been saying no for a month, but now that there's all this chaos, I think they're safe, even if they lose.
What's their best win?
Vanderbilt. Maybe, well, they just beat Arkansas, at Arkansas. So that, Kentucky. I mean,
Florida.
by record, it's Colorado State. And that's sad. But I don't think they're number 3 right now, and they're going to remain number 3. I couldn't see them dropping 9 spots by losing to A&M. I just couldn't.
You're probably right about that. My prediction for Texas is if it's either going to be this week or it's going to be in the SEC championship game. I think Steve Sarkisian's going to light up the what it's like, the folks that are calling on Batman. He's going to light up the McDonald's arches, and you're going to see Manning come in and play quarterback and maybe take over the reins there from Quinn. Quinn is underwhelmed. Quinn is banged up. Now he's got this ankle deal. He's been battling stuff all year. But this dinking and dunking stuff that Texas has been doing, they scored a lot of points against Florida. They still weren't throwing the ball down the field. It was all this, screen, kind of eye candy stuff. That's not going to work against Georgia or in the playoff. So maybe he has to bust it out against A&M on Saturday. We'll see. Again, winner takes all in that one. So I think Sark's under some pressure too, because there's going to be folks saying that what are we doing here with all this talent that we got? If they don't, if you lose to your big stepbrother in your first season when you had a chance to go to Atlanta, or if you squander a potential playoff spot. So fascinating week in the SEC.
Oh, yeah, the Longhorns are going to like that. Coming out hot, Jesse. I appreciate you. So, again, before you go, tell my audience, how can they follow you on social media?
Yeah. You can follow me on Twitter at Jesse R.E. Simonton. So catch me there and catch me somewhere else, here in the near future.